Some people are more accessible or approachable than others. If you are an accessible person, you would know this because strangers maybe at one time have come up to you and just told you all of their griefs and sorrows, perhaps in line at the grocery store or sitting next to them on the airplane. There's something about you that feels safe and approachable, accessible, that people can share things with you and trust that it's going to be okay. Not all of us are accessible in that same way. And I get the sense from reading the Gospels that Jesus was a fairly accessible guy. From the people who cry out to him for healing from the side of the road, trusting that and knowing that sometimes he stops and responds with those healings, to the religious leaders who ask him questions. They're often trying to catch him in something, but they're not hesitant to ask him those questions publicly. Other people come to him just curious with questions. Nicodemus sneaks out at night to meet with him. He knows it may not be safe culturally to do so within his circle of leaders, but he knows that he can go and talk to Jesus. And it's not just those who ask him questions. Jesus also asks questions, and you hear people responding to those. There's the guy who comes and says, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus responds with a question, and they go back and forth for a little while. The disciples ask questions. We find after sometimes Jesus shares a parable, and they are back with just Jesus and the disciples and away from the crowd, they'll kind of stop and go, "Hey, what did that mean?" And they respond to Jesus' questions and his actions. I think of on the Monday, Thursday, we wash feet and remember the story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. And Peter's like, "Hey, not my feet, Lord." And they have this interchange that goes back and forth. All of this is to say that all through the Gospels, it seems that Jesus is accessible. You can ask him questions. You can respond to his questions. There's just a space around him for curiosity and engaging in conversation, which makes today's story interesting. Jesus tells them that the Son of Man must die and be raised. Now, this isn't the first time he has said this. Just a week or so earlier, he has been in a conversation with those disciples and said, "Hey, who do people say that I am?" And they fire right back with answers. "Who do you say that I am?" Peter says, "You're the Messiah." And that's when Jesus begins to tell them about the suffering and death that must come. And right then, Peter jumped in and said, "No, Lord." And right, so there's this back and forth. And yet this time, they hear this news again. And Mark tells us that they were afraid to ask. They didn't understand and were afraid to ask. So Jesus, when they get where they're going, says, "Hey, what were you talking about on the road?" And they were arguing about who's the greatest. So he says, "What were you talking about?" And they're silent. So for all of the accessibility that seems to be with Jesus, in this short 7 verses of Mark, they have questions that they're afraid to ask, and they are silent when Jesus asks them a question. The second one, I think, is pretty easy to understand. When we get caught talking about something we ought not be or doing something we ought not do, sometimes I think our first reaction is to just freeze, right? We don't know what to say, we don't know what to do, we just kind of freeze. I imagine if you had asked those disciples what they would think Jesus would think about them arguing who was the greatest, that they would know the answer, right? And so when Jesus says, "What were you talking about?" they know they were wrong. They freeze. Nobody wants to own up to the conversation they knew they shouldn't have been having. The other one's a little trickier, though. They didn't understand, and they were afraid. There's lots of reasons we can be afraid to ask questions. Sometimes it may be we're afraid how it might look if we demonstrate that we don't understand when others do. Other times it may be that if we answer the question, we know that others will judge us, not because we didn't understand, but for all kinds of other reasons, right? Our culture is not always a safe place to ask questions or to answer questions. And so it's understandable that they might be afraid. But because Jesus has demonstrated himself so accessible, there must be something going on here. And even the week earlier, when he shared the same thoughts about death and resurrection, Peter was not afraid to jump in, and yet this time they are. I wonder if it wasn't so much that they didn't understand, but that they thought they might understand and didn't really want to know the answer. Certainly they didn't understand the be raised resurrection bit, because when the resurrection happens, they still struggle with it. But they maybe got stuck on the death part, when Jesus said the Son of Man must die. And if they're connecting the dots that Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus is the Son of Man, and the Son of Man must die, now all of a sudden, if I think I'm hearing you right, Jesus, you're going to be killed. Maybe they were afraid to ask because they were starting to connect dots and they didn't want to hear the answer. Now, we have a saying for that. What you don't know won't hurt you. What you don't know won't hurt you. It is our way of saying that sometimes we may not fully understand, but we understand just enough that we maybe don't want to ask because we don't really want to have to deal with the answer. What they don't know won't hurt them, right? If they don't ask Jesus about impending death, then they don't have to deal with it necessarily until it happens. They can push it aside and not think about it, not act about it, not have to do anything about it. And this is familiar behavior with us, right? If we don't know, it won't hurt us. I know some of you never go to the doctor, even though you have symptoms that would demonstrate you should probably go to the doctor. But if you don't go, you don't have to hear the doctor tell you what's going on, and then you don't have to change your behavior, right? Like, I know that I tend to order high cholesterol, and that should require changes of behavior. If I never get it checked, then I don't have to deal with it, right? If I don't know, it won't hurt me. Except the reality is those symptoms are still there, and whatever illness is there is still there, and whether the doctor tells me or not, it is bringing harm. Sometimes we want to protect other people as well. I've dealt with many older adults with grown children who have a heart attack or a new diagnosis of cancer, and they don't want to tell their grown adult children because they don't want them to worry. It's kind of taking what you don't know won't hurt you and flipping it around to saying what they don't know won't hurt them. Except it does, right? Like when we think it's not going to hurt us, it is hurting us, and even if it doesn't apply to us, that pain can still be there. I think about some years ago when our military had a policy called Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It was about human sexuality, and it's the very same thing as what we don't know won't hurt us, right? If I don't ask and I don't tell, then I don't have to deal with the situation in front of me, right? So we have people with a different understanding of their human sexuality, and I don't have to learn about it if I don't ask. I don't have to cope with it if I don't ask. I don't have to stretch or change my behavior if I don't ask. What I don't know won't hurt me and won't cause me to change. But here's the thing. It may not hurt me, but it certainly hurts those other people who have to now pretend that they are something different from they are, live their life in a way that is meant to be hidden in plain sight. And that's a stressful way to live, right? So what I don't know may not hurt me, but it does hurt those people because I don't want to ask the question and be curious and understand who they are as a human being. And the reality is it does hurt me because I don't get to experience them for the full wonder and giftedness and amazingness they were as a human being, right? So if I said don't ask, don't tell, it's the same thing as saying what I don't know won't hurt me, except it did hurt others. And ultimately, when we're disconnected from others and they hurt, we are hurt as well. We could look at other places in our culture. Think about the number of women I know who have been sexually assaulted and who were not believed. Right? So there were no consequences. There was no justice. They just told their story, or they didn't tell their story because they knew they wouldn't be believed. And so we have a whole culture of idea of if we don't know, it won't hurt us, right? We don't have to deal with it, except there's a great deal of hurt and pain that happens and continues to get carried on with no opportunity for growth and newness and reconciliation because we continue to not want to have that conversation. I think about poverty. Something like 70% of the kids in our county here, Orange County, are on free and reduced lunch. And I can hear that statistic and be curious, right? And say, well, why is that? Or what would happen? What are the causes? But if I start asking those questions, I might start to find out that my choices and my economics in my household are part of the reason that 70% of the kids don't have enough to eat. But if I don't ask any questions, right, then what I don't know won't hurt me. It won't require me to change. It won't require me to be challenged. It won't require me to ask questions about my lifestyle, even though it may be hurting someone else. And if it's hurting them, right, we all are connected, and somehow then it comes back and is hurting me. I think of our culture's inability to move forward in questions about race. And people of color may say, Pastor, there are systems in our culture that are oppressive and bring deep hurt to us. And I can say, you know what? I'm not a racist, so I'm not going to have that conversation. That's a way of saying what I don't know won't hurt me. It's a way of avoiding having to face something. While I may have a suspicion that our systems may not be entirely fair, if I don't ask, if I don't get curious, if I don't listen to people of color and build relationships and enter into those spaces and hear those stories, then I don't have to change. The systems that benefit me don't have to change. I don't have to do anything. I can just say, what I don't know won't hurt me, even if it continues to bring hurt to others and cuts me off from the wonder and amazing nature of those very people that are crying out in that pain, and I don't get to experience their giftedness in the world in a way that would enrich my life. Now, these are all big issues, right? We can talk about our own healthcare, our own relationships with our kids and our parents. What I don't know won't hurt me, right? We can talk about what they don't know won't hurt them. Don't ask, don't tell. However we want to say this, it's all a way of distancing ourselves from people, from things that are uncomfortable, and living in a space where we maybe don't have to change. Now, here's the thing. The disciples didn't ask their question that day. But their not asking the question did not prevent Jesus' death. It still happened. And their inability to be curious about resurrection didn't stop the resurrection from happening. God wasn't sitting up in heaven saying, hey, once they ask all the right questions and get all the right answers, then resurrection will happen. No, it happened when everyone failed. When they asked the question and said, I don't want to know, don't ask, don't tell, what's in it for me, or what I don't know won't hurt me. Their complete inability to deal with the situation did not stop Jesus' death, and it did not stop his resurrection, which means that we start from a point of this gift of new life. In any situation, whether it's our own personal situation of our body and our mind and our soul in the world, or our participation in the larger systems, any place we land where we could say, whoa, what I don't know won't hurt me. I don't want to have to change. We don't have to be afraid. Because Jesus has already loosed us from death and loosed us from the bounds of sin that keep us in those places of wanting to avoid the hard things. And that freedom then frees us to have those hard conversations, frees us to be challenged and to be changed by the people and circumstances around us as God's grace works through all of the people and circumstances around us. And it's from that point of freedom then that we live into a new life. And my hope is that we can have a culture of curiosity as people of faith. And that culture of curiosity can be inside the bounds of the church and outside as well. I can't tell you how many church meetings, like big meetings I've been to, where are there any questions? And then there's no questions or very few questions. But then people leave the meeting and have all kinds of questions. Well, by not asking them in that space, right, they didn't benefit from the collective wisdom of the whole, hashing out that conversation together, right? Can we be a place where we ask hard questions? Can we be a place where we have hard answers and we listen well and we maybe hurt each other along the way, but have reconciliation and forgiveness that helps us to navigate that together as God changes us and transforms us into these curious people that can change the world? And then when we leave this place, can we have that same culture of curiosity where we listen and pay attention? And even when we want to say, what I don't know won't hurt me, we take that leap and ask those questions and be curious in a way that opens up the fullness of humanity around us. And we just might find that the very thing we're afraid of, right, that change and that difficult stuff, might actually be opened up to this place where we discover the wonders of human beings, their giftedness and their joy and their gratitude. And Yes, sometimes people can be challenging for us, but at the same time, they can bring us such grace and compassion. And in that curiosity, we may discover that there is so much more of that around us than we realized, that God is dragging us step by step into these places of new life that we can be curious about and go kicking and screaming into it, but we can also accept that this is the gift and trust that somehow in that curiosity is grace enough to go around. Amen.